Welcome to the Adventures of Alice and Bob, the podcast where we get root access to the people shaping the world of cybersecurity to find out about their journey, the events that have shaped their career, and maybe those things that still keep them up at night. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Charles Herring, CEO and co-founder of WitFoo. He's spent over 25 years watching and being involved in the evolution of cybersecurity, particularly post 9/11, from the early days of the Wild West into the complex field we know today. Charles brings really unique perspectives, having started his career maintaining FA-18 fighter jets in the US Navy before being tasked with creating one of the first network security groups following the September 11 attacks. Throughout his career, Charles has been on a mission to solve cybersecurity's most persistent problems, getting security teams to work together effectively instead of operating in silos. From his early days defending networks in the Naval Postgraduate School to founding WitFoo, Charles has witnessed the us versus them mentality and how that's evolved within our industry and what it takes to bring teams back together. Charles, welcome to podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, James. Glad to be here.
And I'm just going to call this out at the start. Normally we dive straight into your early career, but you're actually joining us at about 2 a.m. because you've relocated to New Zealand. Is that right?
That's right. We're starting to do some expansion and staffing here in New Zealand and working with the governments here in New Zealand and Australia to bring some of our ideas and collaboration here into the Australian theater.
That's fantastic. And I think you immediately win the prize for the most dedicated guest we've had on joining us in the early hours of the morning. So we really appreciate that.
Oh, glad to be here. Really glad to be here.
So looping back to where this journey all began, what was your initial path into technology and then cybersecurity? You started off in the US Navy, right?
That's right. So I grew up as a kid in the 80s playing on computers, and I had a job working at a drug testing company where I built all the networks. Those, if you remember the days of 90s tech kids, are what do they call us, wizards, IT wizards, or whatever the thing was back in those days. But I remember I was staring in my computer monitor one day, and I realized I was going to live my entire life behind this desk, and I had to get out of there. So I ran away and joined the Navy. I didn't tell anybody I left. My mother had some trouble hunting me down months later, but went off, started working on jet aircraft, worked on the electronics and weapon systems on F-18 for a number of years, and continued messing around with computers and doing some side projects along the way. When 9/11 happened, I was stationed out of Japan, deployed out of Japan, and was asked to go to the Naval Postgraduate School to spin up the network security group and start sorting through how we might defend against cyber attacks on the heels of the terror attacks. That was quite the transition, because at that point, naval aviation had evolved into a very mature craft. Everything that we did was well documented, the way that we trained people, quality assurance, all the pieces were very well documented. And one of the things that was clearly missing when I got to spin up the network security group was we had no pubs, so we didn't have publications on how to do the work. We didn't have documentations on how to train the workers. And also we didn't have a great way of creating strategic and operational metrics. So when I was working on aircraft, I would pull a maintenance action, and then I would do the maintenance action. And in doing that, we would document how many hours I spent, what parts broke. All of these pieces of information were generated, some that told us what planes we could fly for different types of operations. But those numbers also boiled up to tell the Navy how they're going to build the next airplane, how many maintenance hours go in to one flight hour, how many people do we need to staff in the squadron. So really the whole of the Navy, from the squadron level all the way up to the Pentagon, were driven off of these metrics that we're generating every time we're doing a maintenance action. And so we're all working off the same data set. And so when I got to the Naval Postgraduate School and we're trying to figure out how do we put together an organization to detect and respond to cyber attack, I started trying to take over the lessons we learned in naval aviation. And a lot of those lessons were hard-earned, or we say written, the NATOPs for the publications were written in blood, because it was the mishaps drove a lot of what we learned. but it's also new. We've only been doing aviation for a short period in human history. There are a lot of crafts that have, centuries of history behind them, but aviation is not one of those. And cybersecurity certainly isn't one of them. It's probably the newest craft. And when I started working at the postgraduate school, one of the unique opportunities I had was I was part of the security directorate and not part of IT, which was pretty unique in those days. It's certainly unique today, in that my department meetings were with the base police, the chief of the police, the intelligence officers, and those running force protection operations. So we're talking about who do we need to catch, who do we need to bomb, who do very operational outcomes that were confusing when I go to IT meetings and we're talking about what ACLs we're going to put in place, or what patches we're going to make. It seemed like we were talking about we're living in two completely different universes with different outcomes and different metrics. And that really started to guide my thinking. And I don't think we say it very often anymore, but in those days, we often would remark that security and IT were diametrically opposed. That was a very common thing to say. I don't think any of us get away thinking that any longer. But we were, and it was quite aggressive how we would interact with one another in IT, trying to keep services running for the staff and faculty, and us trying to keep the worst outcomes from happening on the networks and with the devices. So it was quite a challenge in those days. But the nice thing we had after 9/11 was this really big idea of who us was and who them were. It needed more nuance probably than it had, but we had this big idea of who the good guys were and who the bad guys were trying to harm us. So a lot of collaboration existed in those early days that, over the last few decades, just seeing degrade as we've sort of gotten into more specialization, deeper silos, and it's become even more complicated to work with each other when our work products don't inform other work products. So what I'm doing in one cubicle doesn't help the folks down the hallway or across the street or across the country do their work.
It's interesting when we see these kind of times of immense stress on the systems. So, you mentioned 9/11 there, and it's suddenly a lot of things that either weren't happening at all or were moving very slowly suddenly come together and get accelerated. And we saw a similar shift with COVID, right? When suddenly entire workforces went remote overnight and all these things suddenly happened. And then a few years down the line, things start retreating back into their silos. Why do you think we fall into these traps and don't continue that momentum and that collaboration that we were able to achieve such great results with in a short period of time?
Well, I think that there's a boiling of the frog when it comes to trauma. There's little micro hurts we have each day where we feel slighted with our coworkers, and much of that's driven by misunderstanding and miscommunication, and that we don't understand a lot of times what the other people are trying to do, why it's important, and how they're communicating with us. And likewise, they don't understand what we're doing. And so that type of conflict creates trauma. And the more trauma we have with each other, the bigger the barriers get. During the times of, COVID, as you referenced, and during 9/11, there were sort of big moments to where we understand the importance of getting things done, and that the small hurts or even the big hurts we've had become much smaller in perspective when laid against the backdrop of these big events. But, looking at the way that it happens is really day by day, and hurt by hurt, miscommunication after miscommunication. And also the other thing we have in cybersecurity is we've been living for years having too much work. And I don't mean like 20% too much work. I mean, I've spent the last 25 years watching analysts do security operations, and most of them can't get 1% of their work done in a day. And so that's a very traumatic occupational place to be, to where you can do everything you can do and get 1% done. And often I've counseled them, like, just go to the bar and do nothing, because at least you'll have a good beer. Have a be drunk, work on your resume, get out of here, because doing the 1% doesn't seem like a sustainable option. If you have to pick the right 1% every day, or catastrophic things happen to your career or to the organization, that's a tough component. And then you're dealing with that stress, and you're trying to interact with other people through that stress, which is then creating more and more trauma. So you have miscommunication, you have overwork, and I sometimes call them the 7 unstable conversations of cybersecurity, but essentially everybody we talk to, the operators don't understand what the machines are trying to tell them. We just have billions of messages spewing at us every day that are in random formats. Our managers don't understand what work we're doing. What's the unit of work? I mean, it was one of the biggest debates I have is, what work are we supposed to be doing? How do we define a unit of work? You have a podcast, you're gonna have an episode. This is the unit of work that everyone agrees is what's being produced. And I get in an Uber, there's a trip. I go go out for dinner, there's a table. There's a defined unit of work that you can look at. How much did it cost us to make? How many people do we need to staff? How many can we make per period? And so all of these ways that we manage each other come around a unit of work that's been very elusive for us in cybersecurity. And then managers talking to their bosses about why they're spending so much money on these tools. And so you have this disconnect on, why do we need a firewall? I thought we already had security. Or why do we need, what's this? Why do we have 3 things for identity? And it becomes a very difficult set of conversations, and none of them innately help the others. Me talking to the computers about where are we being attacked doesn't help me translate that into a profit and loss statement for the board of directors. So, and then beyond that, you have, how do organizations talk to each other and share information like good neighbors? How do we interact with law enforcement in a way that doesn't create undue risk for the organization? So we have all of these types of unstable conversations that we can't solve, and all that instability creates trauma, stress, and dysfunction, which is great for the adversary, because the adversary can drive right between those gaps that are created by our dysfunction. And so until we're better equipped to work together, it's going to continue to be the golden age for the worst among us.
And one of the points you touched on there of being able to measure a unit of work, and I see a lot of organizations I work with default into cybersecurity becoming very reactive all the time. They're just responding to incidents, they're firefighting. And when you talk to them about the proactive side and, patching things, removing privileges, controlling applications, all these things we know are really good things to do, but there's often not a unit of work. There's not a metric behind it. So they default to, we just firefight the instance, and a lot of the proactive things, because there's no defined, we did this thing and this is how many attacks we know it is now prevented, because it's often hard to prove a negative if something hasn't happened.
Yes.
Do you see that playing out in the teams that you've worked with?
Yeah, the biggest thing that we found in research so when we first started doing the testing with the partners we've been working with over the last 10 years, was we thought we were going to help them respond faster by getting these units of work together. And the way that we have done it, which isn't the only way and may not even be the best way, but what we came up with is, we're going to take theories of crime and look for activity that matches that theory, that someone's trying to extort our money via ransomware, or someone is trying to gain unauthorized access, or whatever the theory is, and then connect the evidence to that theory. And then you have a unit. And then we can, one of the first things we found working with the University of Chicago years ago was, every investigation they were doing was leading to something disrupted it. They had a control in place that stopped it, which means they probably shouldn't be investigating it, and they shouldn't be investigating it, or they should be investigating it as a lower priority. And so we sort of said, okay, let's see if we can make a heuristic to do that same kind of checking that they're doing automatically, to differentiate between a unit of work that's active and one that's been disrupted by control. So we came up with this disruption piece. So then what started happening when we started looking at what's disrupted versus what's open the first thing in this model is just, if we pull in all the evidence and you have all the time, which computers have much more access to time than we have. They can do so many more calculations in a cycle than we can. And so when we started looking at, okay, if we pull in all the data from all the things and started modeling it as law enforcement would do an investigation, you don't want to say, do you want endpoint or do you want network? In the same way that you wouldn't say, do you want ballistics or do you want the medical examiner's report? As a detective, you want to have all of it. And you want to be able to sort it through. So as we started looking at getting all the data in, the first thing we realized was the basis that we started with controls, as you're mentioning, James, is very important. That if you have the vulnerability data and you have what's happening on the network and you have what's happening on the endpoint, the first thing it's telling you is where the problems are. And then you move from looking at the units of work and say, if we had this tool that was in a protect mode on these scenarios instead of just a detect, then we would have more disruption, which would mean less human work. And so that progressed until we realized everything's being disrupted in a healthy network. And so then what becomes the work of most of the security teams is, how do we ensure that our controls are effectively deployed and maintained, and that gaps aren't opening for, we had a merger and they're using a different tool set, or we have rogue IT. So these guys have decided to spin up their own microservices. And so it really becomes about fireproofing the house instead of firefighting 1,000 fires per day. And, but the unit of work informs that, and it forms it. So you're basically moving from incident response being the primary labor force to good security engineering and planning being the better place, which is better for the business. It's less expensive and there's a lower risk profile when you're keeping the house from catching on fire than being really good at putting the house fires out. But yeah, that starts at a unit of work. And then you can also then take that, now that you're looking at, I have this tool, it saved us 1,000 labor hours or labor cycles, units of work where humans needed to be involved per month. Then you can go to the vendor and say, okay, that tool is worth it. It paid for itself, assuming it's not obscenely priced. Then you have a basis to talk to the vendor and say, if you make the following feature changes, that will have the following impact to our labor and to our risk, and then we can reflect that value in how we're paying you. And the same way, going back to the earlier conversation, now you're getting much closer to a profit and loss statement. If you're working in manufacturing in a business and you say, I need new boxes because it'll reduce our per unit cost by 10 cents, and the ROI will happen in the first 3 days. CFO gets that argument. You can make that investment. And so a lot of my work has been trying to bridge that part of, how do we take those units of work and get them so that the chief information security officer can talk to the chief financial officer in a language that the chief financial officer is going to understand, which is largely gap accounting. And so, but yes, absolutely, the unit of work becomes a basis for all of that accounting. And
I can definitely see the avionics technician and that, mature craft approach coming in here, because, with any plane, you have multiple redundancies, but you don't wait for the wings to fall off or the engine to catch fire. You do the maintenance ahead of time. You have those units of work defined. You can measure that and roll up those metrics.
That's right. And also it helps you prioritize what you should be focusing on, and looking at the security program as the more boring pieces become a lot more exciting. When you start looking at audit, there's this idea we have on the data science side that I call the predestination of data. That, we have just, as we've been talking, trillions of signals have been generated about this conversation that we're having, on your side, on my side, on the stuff monitoring in between. And the way we look at it is, okay, if we're receiving the signal, what could happen in the entire lifespan of the signal? Meaning, who might benefit from something that's created from it? And the challenge we've had in cybersecurity is we tend to build tools that only look at one persona. The security analyst is going to need this. So let's build another tool that's looking at the data for someone else. But if you look at this may be used to prosecute a case someday. This may be used to validate or test a control. This may be used for HR. And so we have all of these different potential use cases that if we put them all on the same table and we bring everybody together and say, what would your reporting look like? Then as the signals are coming in, we're building them on a life cycle that ministers to all of the people that it could minister to, and getting that data built and collected as we need to, which is a data guy. That's been huge for me because we've spent pretty much the last 50 years doing what I call junk drawer data collection. And it's gotten worse as with data lakes, as we put all the data somewhere and think that eventually we'll go back and dig through it. But if we don't, it's too big to fix later. We sort of have to know the questions that we're going to interrogate that data against the moment it's born. And then more darkly, I also believe in tagging data with a time to live. So the moment it's born, we already know the second it's going to die. And so the whole span of the data is built in. But absolutely, it's the understanding everyone that might be impacted in the course of every signal that's being collected, and then how those things can be used later to coordinate work between different people that have different vocabularies and different understandings of the data. Me being an aircraft mechanic's one thing. There's a pilot in the seat that needs to operate off the same data in a different way. There's supply people that have to operate on that data, making different operations. So it really is about how do you bring people together around the same data.
Yeah, you're describing a wonderful and a very kind of mature process there, and a shared language and shared understanding, and also that thing of, making sure that everyone understands the impact of all these things. But actually, one of the stories I love from your background is earlier on in your career, you actually, I believe an admiral told you he wasn't sure whether he was going to court-martial you or give you a medal because you had to respond to an incident at a time when things maybe weren't as mature and evolved as they are today. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of those early learnings in your career there.
Yeah. So when I got to the Naval Postgraduate School, unfortunately, most of these, I'm sure all of these things are fixed now. But when I got there, we had a Class B of IP space with no net or firewall around it. We had research going on. We had exchange students walking around the base, many of which were probably spies. And so I had all of the problems to deal with. And I think it was 2002. The blaster worm hit the internet, and it was just it was an SMB worm that you could connect directly to the socket, inject the exploit, and then the worm would turn around and start looking for other hosts to attack. And so we had spent a lot of time trying to get patch management in place, get firewalls in place, and it became quite contentious with the IT team on how fast that was going to roll out and where the priorities were. So the whole campus just became destroyed when that worm rolled out. We had rooms and rooms stacked full of computers that had to be wiped and reimaged and rebuilt. My team spent weeks helping in that endeavor, and it was a nightmare. The whole campus, as you can imagine, as everything was broken. And it feels like a couple days later, but I'm sure it was a few months later, the CVE for what was going to be the Sasser worm came out. And as soon as I saw that code, I immediately knew, okay, this is going to kill us. This is going to be the exact same thing we just finished recovering from. And I pleaded my case. I begged them, let's just get this, let's get it done. We're going to be screwed. And anyway, it went nowhere again. Even after, I'm talking about a big thing normally brings people together, it wasn't big enough. Destroying all the computers wasn't big enough because there was that much trauma. And I will admit, I was probably the cause for most of the trauma. Being a young kid in those days, I was in the security group. We could carry sidearms. We're that security. We're the most terrifying group walking around the base, kicking in the doors. We take your hand off the keyboard. So I was not, did not develop proper empathy skills in those days. So I will take the blame for how hypercharged it was. But I couldn't stomach another worm breakdown. So I I stayed up and wrote this worm to infect our machines using the proof of concept code on the CVE, and so I unleashed it on limited to our Class B space. Though I guess it would have been a different situation had I let it clean up the whole internet. But the payload of the exploit was to apply the patch and then look for other machines that needed the patch. And I did. I patched several thousand machines over the course of the 12 hours that it ran the thing. But I did break a machine that was running some research modeling that it had been running for months. It was very well funded project, and it blew that machine up and blew out the research on applying the patch. So I did get called up in front of the admiral one of two times, and was asked. He says, my nickname's Fish, my handle's Fish. He said, Fish, I don't know whether or not I'm supposed to give you a medal or court martial you. And I said, well, if I get a say admiral, I would prefer the medal. But didn't get a medal. Got neither, fortunately for that. But I did later get a medal, but not for not for writing a benevolent worm, as I called it in those days. But the things we do just for dysfunction, right? And obviously that caused more dysfunction along the way, prevented what would have been a pretty catastrophic meltdown again. And the other thing was both of those worms their payloads weren't that horrible. If you imagine like today, if that was the payload was encryption for ransomware, or the stealing of data, which we've seen really picked up shortly after that period of time in the aughts. But yeah, that was my experience with that. And I did another one where that same admiral wanted the lights wanted to save power. There was a big green initiative, and so I wrote a script to start shutting machines down after hours, but broke a couple more machines for that. But anyway, what are you going to do? You got to keep the admiral happy.
Well, it's interesting because they now, there's literally courses out there talking about hack yourself first and do all these things. And that's exactly what you went out and did. And actually you were I find it fascinating that you were this young guy with a sidearm dealing with IT security. And at the same time, a young guy in Germany who I believe wrote the Sasser worm about 17 days after Microsoft released a patch for it. He's the one causing all these threats. And then you're on, over in the US going, okay, I need to fix all these. I'm going to use exactly the same methodology he used of exploit code, go out there, push it out, but I'm going to use it to patch it. And there's days that I think we romanticize a little bit now where, these big threats were worms that just popped up an annoying message or slowed a computer down or crashed it. And then, like you say, you had to re-image. But how times have changed, or maybe they haven't changed that much.
Yeah, yes and no. Everything stays the same and nothing stays the same at the same time, for sure. But it was funny when I left the Naval Postgraduate School. I remember my going away party. The IT team shows up at my going away lunch, and they handed me a bottle of gin. I was a big fan of gin, and they said, "Good luck." I mean, it was just like the most. They were so glad I was out of there, and out of their hair, driving them crazy. But it was a tough time. I think it was also I was scared. I mean, I think that was the hardest point. That was the first time in my whole career that I was terrified I was not going to accomplish the mission, that I wasn't going to be able to do the part that was given to me. And I just remember sitting around thinking something horrible is going to happen. I can't move the needle here. I don't know how to train my people. I don't know how to build workflows. And we spent a lot of time and did some good work on building units of work and being able to track those things. And but it was a pretty terrifying, debilitating thought to realize no matter what I do here, at any moment it could go horrible, and I'll be unable to stop it. And that was one of the darkest times in my cybersecurity career, and also drove why I want to help people deal with that. And it's also realizing in my point of view, looking back on it, the IT guys were trying to do the best they could, and I didn't have the emotional intelligence to see that at the time. but we all have different parts that we're trying to play, and working against each other is um, it hinders the greater good.
Yeah, not self but country, I believe the unofficial
Yeah,
motto of the Navy is.
that's right.
Not self but network, maybe.
That's right. Yeah. you know?
So then you mentioned you left the Navy, and I believe you went on to do some consulting and then working at a vendor. How did that change come about for you?
So when I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, we had, again, I had no pubs, we had no idea of what to do. So it was really largely spending most of my day trying to discover what's possible, and then the rest of the day trying to implement and test it. And so we did a number of things. I was lucky enough to participate with Chris Eagle's School of Root, which has the fame of, well, a couple of things. One is DEF CON's captured the flag so many times they've been asked not to compete anymore. Secondly, it was quoted on Silicon Valley by Guilfoyle as no one's breaking in here, not state of China, not the School of Root. So I got to shadow and work with those guys and learn a good bit about what we'd call red teaming now, or so that was nice. Got to participate in some of that work, and then partnered with InfoWorld magazine, and asked them to send me all of your. This is when the test center was still open before we killed journalism and cybersecurity, but or at least test centers, testing things, writing up product reviews, and so I bring in all the gear, run it on my Violent network, write up the test, and give the results back to Bob Garza, who would write those up. And then we also worked with different universities, and one of them was Georgia Tech, who was working on network behavioral anomaly detection. And the work that they did became a product called Stealth Watch. The company was Landcope, named after Dr. Copeland at Georgia Tech. And so we were doing some of the research on another project we called Terminator, which was also looking at deviations or changes in network behavior. So when I left the Navy, I did consulting work, mostly working on how to share intelligence across intelligence and workflows across different organizations inside of the U.S. government, and took that about as far as I was going to go. And there was, in those days, I was building what were largely what we would call SOAR or playbook, where you would have signals come in, you would do enrichment, and then people would do work, and then the flows would move on. And I realized it was too rigid. It was too easy for the adversary to maneuver. You write a new playbook. The adversary can write a quicker work around the playbook, and so we took that about as far as we could. But I was called up to go into sales engineering, which I didn't know how to do any of it. I wasn't a sales guy, but there was 13 states in central U.S. that were unable to explain what network behavioral anomaly detection was. And so I was able to join that team and go through and meet with much of the Fortune 500 in the Midwest, manufacturing and the rest, and work with them and their teams. And it became very clear very soon that the same problems that we're having, a decade earlier in the U.S. government and Department of Defense were even worse. It become worse in corporate America. That the ability to work with one another across departments, the ability to detect and respond to threats, were all highly degraded. That was great as a sales guy, because every time I put my box in there was always a catastrophic problem. Hey, your data's going to China, or you've got a salesperson stealing all your information, or there's always something. There's always a smoking gun. Which, if you ever try to do cybersecurity sales, that's awesome. That makes for a short sales cycle when you can walk in it and do that kind of detection. But the stress on everyone's face, it was just massive. And I realized we had sort of gotten into this old lady that swallowed the fly problem, and that we would, we made the firewall, we swallowed the firewall to fix the AV, we swallowed the EDR to fix and so just we keep building these products that are incremental, that each create more problems for us to deal with, instead of trying to rethink what we're doing. And from my background, being a sidearm carrying security guy, I thought network security was focused on security, where, and information security was focused on security, where most of us were focused on IT. And I realized that, IT has been so great for human beings. For the transformation we've had in our lifetime has been mind blowing. And largely we've been able to do that because we've modeled what we learned in manufacturing to IT, that we're creating things, we're merging things, we're shipping things, we're storing things. And a lot of the ideas and ways that we've done manufacturing for the last industrial revolution informed how we did IT. But the problem with cybersecurity is it really has nothing to do with IT or manufacturing, that we can't use the same approaches. It's law enforcement. It's an investigative mindset that has some progressive and objective components to be met, but there is a lot of reasoning and creativity that has to go into these work processes that aren't just input, that aren't Boolean gates of things coming in and other things coming out the other side. So taking all of that, looking at how do we work with different organizations, that was eye-opening to me in the private sector. How do we take some of that and get teams working together that are most of the people in cybersecurity came up out of IT. And I think that's largely helpful. You can't do any of these things if you don't understand the OSI model and other key components of how networking and computers work. But there's also someone's doing this in cybersecurity, right? It's not just a packet failed. The packet was too big and caused a buffer overflow. It's a person decided to do that has an outcome in their mind, whether that's stealing money or stealing data, harming the organization, whatever it might be. There was a human endeavor behind it. And so in cybersecurity, talking about the unit of work earlier, the unit of work has to explain the human endeavor. What is the harm that's coming to us? So when we go to the CEO or the board and say, we have someone trying to steal our money via extortion, instead of trying to explain how a key exchange works in ransomware, that's something they can understand. We have 3 different groups actively trying to encrypt our boxes so they can extort money from us. So here's our plan. But anyway, all I have to say, working in sales, you realize you're selling to different people. You're selling to the people cutting the checks, you're selling to people that are using the tools. And we also have to solve for renewal, right? We have to have a relationship that's going to last past the sales cycle. So all those things really was eye-opening to me, and understanding how broad the miscommunications were inside of organizations, how big, how many silos there were, and how dysfunctional they were. And it led to a number of interesting observations. Several times I would go into a breach in a hospital. Was doing this just a few months ago, and I asked, have you called the other hospitals? And they looked at me like I was crazy. I said, well, if your house is getting robbed or you notice someone in the front yard, wouldn't you tell your neighbors? You don't want to be a bad neighbor. So, but there's no process. And we're so far behind in understanding how do we even call our neighbors to say someone's trying to steal patient data or trying to brick the MRI machines. And so we don't know how to have that conversation, which is again a great boon to the adversary. But going back to my IT versus security, I had this small part to play in the Target breach in 2013. The tool that we made at Landcope was built to be a security tool, but the telemetry it took in was from NetFlow. So all your routers and switches would send in information. It would build profiles on what's communicating with what, but it also built an audit trail of what communicated with what. And when the Secret Service started doing the investigation over at Target, I got a call because the network team had purchased a network monitoring. We had purchased our tool to monitor the network. So, how much bandwidth flowing through different links or flowing through different interfaces from network to network. And it was out of support. No one was using it. But it ended up having every record of every network communication that had gone across the network. And it was interesting. The way it was found as the investigators are going through and doing discovery, the box was there, and no one knew the box was there. The network guys that had bought it were already gone. The security guys didn't know to use it. And if you remember, James, in those days, the FireEye gave victim shamed Target a good bit for, we sent you alerts on this. You remember this part?
Yeah, it was the kind of the needle in the haystack thing of, oh, well, it was totally in the logs. It's just you had so many thousands of them you couldn't actually process. Like you said earlier, that challenge of, that you can only do 1% of the jobs you need to do.
Yeah, it is this crazy challenge. And it's also in cybersecurity, it's the only thing that I'm aware of where it's still politically acceptable or sometimes encouraged to victim shame. I don't think we have that anywhere else in the Western world, where it's okay to beat somebody up for getting victimized. And so it's a crazy component, which again throws more trauma on, and largely we're doing it to ourselves. It's not so much the press screaming at us for being guilty, it's us screaming at each other for not doing enough.
Well, even in that case, there was it Fazio Mechanical Services, the HVAC engineers, like a really small HVAC company, and took a lot of heat around that because it was their kind of credentials that were compromised and used to log in. But then there's all this, well, who's the burden of security on here? Because you're giving them access to your entire network. So there's the challenge there.
Right. Why were the ACLs configured to allow those credentials to move along? And I think those are the broader challenges. And you talk about, that's another one, organizations working with each other. In the time I've been in business since leaving the Navy, the way we do business has changed radically. It used to be we would build companies like nation states that if you needed horseshoes, you'd hire a blacksmith, and had your HR and your chefs and everybody in house. And now we outsource everything. All of us have a ton of vendors that we interact with, and we have to have some level of trust so that we can collaborate, but we also have to validate their controls. And most of us are tired of filling out security questionnaires every time we try to go into business with someone, whether they're going to be a customer or a partner or whatever we're working through, but and are sort of desperate for a better way to have that conversation, right? To have some stamp to say they've done at least what they need to do. But yeah, that was that's certainly the biggest one on third-party risk, is how do we manage third-party risk? And since then, was that 12 years now since that breach happened, we have more third parties. All of us do. Just so many more people that have access in some ways to our infrastructure to control.
Our infrastructure perimeters exploded. It's not just the network, and it's the cloud. We're letting third parties have access to resources in our cloud systems. They don't even need to get within the network anymore.
Right, and that's true. Like, you think about the discovery that my box was sitting in a data center in Minneapolis. There's no more boxes. Right, there's some cloud somewhere. Hopefully, in which tenancy, you can spin up a whole VPC, a whole new tenancy that the organization may not even know about. So, where we used to have rogue IT, at least there was a computer you could walk in and say, "What's that computer?" Or that thing has an IP address. What is it? What does that thing belong to? And now we've lost visibility into a good bit of all that. I think just one other. I was working with a global manufacturer at one point, and walk in, we see intellectual property leaving, going overseas to a big Asian country I'm not going to name because I'm scared of them. But as the data left, I said, okay, what are we going to do? And immediately I started seeing closing ranks. Right, this is going to be a big deal. This is going to be, their designs are going to roll out somewhere in another part of the world. That's going to have a long-term impact on the brand and the profitability of the company. And I was a vendor doing my best to advocate for what should be done, but you have an impact to the business that probably never made it to the business. Almost certainly never made it up to law enforcement for national security concerns. And so we have these exploits at that level that are able to happen because we don't feel the ability to communicate with one another and share that information because we're worried of what the shareholders are going to think, what our bosses are going to think if they have to tell the shareholders, what the government's going to do to us if they find out that we somehow let that happen. So it's a real travesty, just to be so terrified. In every job, everyone's terrified of working with the other people that are also terrified. And so I think we're one of the last crafts that have that type of problem. You look at healthcare when they're understaffed, they at least know how to communicate with one another, even though they're all typically living in very stressful and traumatic circumstances, but they can do that together. And I think when we go to conferences like DEF CON and Black Hat or regional conferences, from one of my GERCONs coming up here shortly in Grand Rapids, but we can commiserate for the length of that conference together and give each other some level of sal. But it really is, I think, one of the most stressful places to be working right now. And I think the attrition that we see is validates that. And, and as you have people that are hurt, we're going to tend to be less able to help one another and more likely to hurt one another and working together. And that was one of the things that really drove me crazy over blue teaming and red teaming. And still, that we build these things, and technically I love the idea, but we sort of skipped over, and some organizations have figured it out, but as a craft, we haven't sorted out how do those teams work together, in a way that is collaborative. And, the idea is purple teams, but also you have auditors. They're important. The insurers are important. All these people have an important part to play that aren't trying to hinder one another any more than I was directly trying to hinder the IT staff back in the NPS days.
Well, it's interesting to see these, they say history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. And you've seen that throughout your career with, the early days where it was IT versus these new security people. And then it was, as things have evolved, you've seen people retreat into different silos and different problems. And actually, if we look at the modern age, we were just talking about cloud, right? Someone's introduced cloud, and either that's suddenly IT's problem and they know nothing about it, or you've got a new cloud team who are again in a silo and a new identity security team who are in another silo. When you started, your current venture with WitFoo, what were the challenges that you'd seen across your career that you were setting out to solve at WitFoo?
Yeah, so mostly it was trying to get people operating on the same data and pointed at the same information, where the data could be pivoted into the vocabulary of the different personas. And really, the biggest part was getting the unit of work workable. Is trying to define some unit of work that the operator could agree is a unit of work, but also the CEO of the company has no idea about cybersecurity could agree as a unit of work. And then once we worked through that, and that was a lot. It really was a lot, just solving something that would work there. And again, what we do may or may not be the best thing, but it is a workable thing. And then trying to understand what questions people are asking. And I was thinking earlier today about this moment where the admiral at the Naval Postgraduate School, he came down to me. We need a report on some situational thing. I said, okay, well, what would you like that report to say? Because that's going to tell me which data I'm going to look at. And so we have that mindset. If we're not forced to look at all the data, if we're not forced to reconcile all the truth, we can come up with whatever story serves our interest. And so when we get everyone working on the same data, then we're now forced to have the same conversation. We're now constrained by the same basis of fact. And, we have this challenge throughout humanity right now, is just we're clawing at what is fact. so we can have a conversation with one another and trying to agree upon how we define what facts are. And so that's been the first thing. The second thing is there's just so much that first problem, the first unstable conversation I was discussing is we have so many signals coming from so many things, and they could all be in English or Farsi or some language that we understand. There's no reason syslog has to be in a cryptic language, but every product is in its own language that we decide that it's going to be a timestamp and then an integer representing protocol, or maybe the protocol will spell it out, or maybe we'll pad the IP addresses, or maybe we'll put them in. And so there's just absolutely no adopted standard on how we're transmitting messages. And so we run into the situation to where we're trying to translate babble. Go back to the target and FireEye problem. Okay, there's a message that you sent, hidden among many messages, but also in a nonsense language. If it would have been in Klingon, it would have been clearer. There's nothing about the message that the human can read. The machine receiving the message doesn't understand the message being transmitted to it. And so we have this problem is based on too many linguistics. Then we throw on top of that the rate that those messages are generated. And when we apply law enforcement approaches to processing that data, we also have to understand other things like what's being described. So, we're maintaining state that, think about the old crime boss boards, we have new information about this boss. He's now, yeah, he's talking to the other lieutenant, and they have the other, so you're maintaining state across all these relationships, which is in a network. It's going to be millions, billions of relationships that have to be tracked and state over time. And that has a compute problem. You can, I write software for a living, but my software is run on hardware, and as affordable as I make my software, it doesn't make any difference if it costs you, 64U of hardware, to run it. So we spent a lot of time on the computer science part of how do we maintain the state? How do we, process this data? Right. And so once you have that, then you can start having conversations, but it's a whole lot. I think, we've essentially spent 10 years in research and development, building the things. We've had great partners and, across the industry and the government and in the private sector and enterprise. And, they've let us just play with their data, show it to their people. And, every time I was sure we had it right, and I was wrong every time. So we were always off. So like, all right, we'll see in 6 to 18 months, and we'll bring another iteration trying to solve for this crazy communication problem. And that's just inside of an organization. And, my big goal, James, really to bring us together and build what looks like a good neighborhood, where neighbors do talk to neighbors and share information about what's happening in the neighborhood, where neighbors feel safe calling the police, and police are able to interact with the citizenry in a way that isn't intrusive, or cumbersome to the citizens trying to do well. And so we have to in talking on that piece, I tell my law enforcement friends, if I get rear-ended, you show up and take a statement at the car, that's fine. If you follow me home and go through all my stuff, that's not okay. And so that's how enterprise feels when they call the police, is you're going to come in and go through everything, and you're going to find all these things and create all this risk and create such a mess. And then I tell my enterprise friends, look, if every day your business is making receipts, and you're taking some of the receipts, but not all the receipts, and throwing them in garbage bags, and throwing those garbage bags on trucks, and then at the end of the year, you're dumping all those trucks on your accountants, you suck. That's a bad way. That's a bad way to do that. And yet we run our security operations centers without any regard to a law enforcement outcome. We're not collecting it as evidence. We're not treating it as evidence. We're thinking about only keeping the day-to-day going and not contributing to a safer community. So there's, and there's reasons for all these things. Again, it's trauma that creates the silos, and then it splits us apart.
And it loops right back to that start concept you talked about, where the actions you were performing on the jet, you were informing people, you were collecting the metrics and data, because then that made the decisions about what the next procurement process was going to look like, or in the case of the government and law enforcement, maybe what the next cybersecurity framework requirements were going to be like.
That's exactly right. And we have ways of doing that and ways of modeling it, in that, all the information that doesn't need to go upstream. Talking about COVID again, we had, patient records where they needed to be, meaning that the doctors and the hospitals need to know, my blood type and my medical history. But those doing public health don't need to know that. They need to know how many people of a demographic had the following characteristics, or have responded well, or having problems, or was mortality or morbidity. And then you have statistics that are blowing up. So this meta of meta allows us to operate appropriately and control risk. So just this evolution of data is a area where we spend a whole lot of time thinking about what's the minimal amount of data that allows someone to maximally do their work, and how do we control. And of course, in the military, we have the same thing on controlling who has too much information. You want to have enough information to make good decisions, but not so much information that you can become a liability. And I think in cybersecurity in general, we have a vendor problem, and that startups like mine have been able to receive a whole lot of money for making a small iterative technology that we can then sell off to another company, as we did at Landcope to Cisco, but not address bigger problems. We're not funded to say, let's go rethink how we're doing everything or how we're all working together. There's just not a mechanism to fund that. And so working on it has been quite challenging. It's very rewarding. I mean, it really is nice to have people work together. But we have trauma with the guy doing the firewall work can't talk to the guy doing endpoint. And so it's a infuriating problem. They didn't create it, right? They were put into a situation of dysfunction and trauma. And then the way that they're reacting is out of a place of protection. And so it's a challenging piece. I think we're going to get there, whether or not our way is the way we get there or not. I think as humans, we find a way to come out the other side, find a way to work with one another. And cybersecurity is just such a new thing. I mean, it really is such a new thing in human history that, as a 20-year-old, I was working on it, and here I am, 25 or so, whatever I am now. Not aging well, if you're looking at the video, but it's this very short craft where I can see in my life almost all of it, right? And not many crafts can you do that in. Can you have someone in a lifetime have all of the experience or been a part of the whole journey that humans have been taking? So, yeah, I think but the data is the thing. I mean, data is both the core of the problem and, in my estimation, our salvation is going to be through our ability to manage this really immense this data that we're creating. Every day we create more data than we had created in the history of man before we started doing this. I mean, it's a massive amount of information. So, but yeah, it's a real challenge on how that information and how that evolution has caused dysfunction and hurt between people that are all trying to do good, but have been tasked with something pretty impossible, at least up to this point.
Well, to paraphrase Homer Simpson, data, the cause of and solution to all of our problems.
That's right. That's right. Though it's not quite as tasty as what Homer was referring to, but yes, absolutely.
Not at all. We're about out of time here today, unfortunately, Charles, and I think we could keep on talking for a lot longer, but it's nearly 3 a.m. and we need to get you to bed. So if people want to find out more about WitFoo, the things that you're up to, or just get in touch with you, what's the best place to do that?
Yeah, so you can go to witfoo.com, WITFOO, our crazy little name we came up with 10 years ago now. I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me, Charles Herring. Charles Herring WitFoo will find me. Or you can email me at charles@witfoo.com. That one's not hiding that one. That will make it to me as well. But I appreciate the time, James. It's been a treat. The best thing I've done at 2:00 in the morning in recent memory.
Well, that's, for a 25-year-old, as you claim you are, that's a fantastic accolade there. So, unfortunately, that's all we have time for on this episode of The Adventures of Alice and Bob. The Adventures of Alice and Bob. Let's go with that. A big thanks to our guest, Charles Herring. From fixing fighter jets to fighting worms with worms and a whole lot more since. It's been great to hear about Charles's journey and the things he's up to today. As always, thanks to our super producer, Jesse, and the team at Beyond Trust who make this podcast happen. I'm James Maud, and this has been Adventures of Alice and Charles.
Thank you for listening to The Adventures of Alice and Bob. Do you have any stories from the cybersecurity trenches that would make our listeners' jaws drop? If so, we would love to have you on the podcast. Maybe you faced down a ransomware attack with nothing but coffee and determination, discovered a breach in the most unexpected way, or had a pen test go horribly wrong. Whatever your tale, funny, harrowing, or just plain wild, we want to feature you on the show. To share your cybersecurity war stories, email us at booking@merchantsmedia.com.